So my talk today is based on work with John Wallace, who is at the University of Maryland. And I want to begin by showing you a very familiar picture. This is a picture of inequality, trends in inequality from Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century. And there's just been a tremendous interest in inequality lately, to a large extent stimulated by Piketty's work. But this work on inequality focuses on material aspects of inequality, on the distribution of income, on the distribution of wealth, on the ability of people to move within that distribution, social and economic mobility. And what I want to do today is shift the focus of attention to a very different kind of equality, and that is the idea that laws should be general. That laws should be general and should apply to everyone, or at least broad categories of everyone in the same way. And so that's, we have a familiar idea about equality before the law. What I'm going to talk about is related to it, but it is not exactly that. What I'm going to talk about is the content of the laws and what governments are doing when they enact the laws. It's about how this talk is about how government works, and then it is about how government works affects the society and the economy. So I call this talk Getting the Model Right because I am arguing that the big achievement of the United States was the achievement of general laws. It's that really transformed the U.S. in a way that made it so economically and politically successful. And I think it's important to get the U.S. model right because U.S. institutions are often held up, or at least they were before the recent time, as a model to the world. And so we want to get that model right. Okay. So the literature on the U.S. model really focuses almost exclusively on the revolutionary Constitution period and on the national government. And I'm not saying that is unimportant. It certainly was important, but it's only part of the story. And in important ways, I want to suggest to you that the government that was created, the institutions that were created at the national level in that revolutionary period did not work. And so the fix for why they didn't work was general laws. And I want to emphasize from the very beginning that the idea that laws should be general was an achievement not of the revolutionary era, but of the mid-19th century. And it was an achievement not of the federal government, but of the states. At the state level, this new concept of that law should be general, this new kind of equality is embedded in fundamental law. It's embedded in state constitutions. Okay. The federal constitution never goes through this transformation. It never is revised with this kind of commitment to general laws. And but I want to suggest to you that the changes that happened at the state level, this move toward general laws, transforms the norms about how government should work. And so it does have an effect on the federal government. The federal government is not the same as a result of the achievement of these laws. Now, I'm going to give you an idea of what I'm talking about by focusing first on the state of Indiana. And I'm going to focus on Indiana because Indiana was the first state that went through this transformation, the full transformation to general laws, and it does it in a constitutional revision in 1851. So there's a lot of text on here, but these are three clauses from the Indiana State Constitution. The top one just says that the General Assembly shall not pass any special or local laws, and then in a variety of special circumstances, which if you read through, will give you a sense of what people were reacting against. Then there's another provision that says, well, okay, we've named a bunch of stuff, But in any case where laws can be general, they have to be general. And then there's a final provision that says corporations have to be created by general laws. Now, Indiana is the first state, as I suggested, to embrace fully this complex of customs. Around the same time, a number of other states went through constitutional changes, and they mostly went part of the way. They do this last part. Several states do this last part, saying that corporations shall not be created by a special act, but must be formed by general laws. And that's going to give you an important clue of what's driving this. This is a response, a reaction against corporate privileges that are given to a favored few people and embodied in the laws. But gradually, over the course of the next several decades, over the course of the rest of the century, almost every other state adopts the same set of reforms. So the points on this graph are individual states. The horizontal axis is the date of when the state adopted a constitutional provision saying that corporations had to be chartered under general laws. The vertical axis is the date when corporations, when the general law provision was added to state constitutions. And so you can see early on in the early years that there are a lot of states that just do the provision for corporations and then only come to the general law provision a couple decades later, mostly in the 1870s. But you can also see that there's this strong 45-degree line. And so very quickly, this becomes the accepted notion of how you write a state constitution. A few states never made the change. My own state of Connecticut is one of them. We can talk about that in the question and answer if you want. Now, one of the goals of this talk is to give you a sense of, why this happens when it did, how we can understand this pattern. And then the other goal of this talk is to talk about how this mattered. Okay, so, before I go into those two big questions, I feel like I have to make this a bit more concrete to give you a sense of what governments were doing before you get this set of constitutional changes. And so I'm going to very quickly give you a sense of what was going on, what kinds of laws the Indiana legislature was passing right before this constitutional revision. But let me just say that all states were like this. States did pass from the very beginning some general laws, but 80 to 90% of their business, of the statutes they enacted, were private laws or local laws. They were things like this. So here's, I'm just going to blip through this. Here's a law that allows someone a particularly named man to file for divorce without the usual evidentiary requirements. Here's a statute that changes someone's name. Here's a statute that allows allows a group of people to form a manufacturing corporation. The only way you could form a corporation was by a special legislative act. So there were lots of these, but this is one example. Here's, you had to go to the legislature to get corporate privileges if you wanted to form a voluntary organization. So this is a reform organization that is getting those kinds of privileges from the state. Local governments also had to go to the state to do lots of things. So here is an act for one county to allow this one county to borrow some money. Here's a legislative act, a state act that allows one county to increase the pay of a particular justice. So this is what legislatures were doing. There's just pages and pages of this stuff in the legislative record. Okay, and then all of this changes. It all disappears after the Constitution is rewritten in 1851. And so there's no more of this kind of stuff. Instead, you get general laws. So here's an act regulating the granting of divorces and tells you what procedures you have to follow. Here's an act if you want to change your name, or if you're an individual or a corporation. Here's an act, a general incorporation act for manufacturing corporations. Here's a general incorporation act that will allow you to form a voluntary association, a club, or a reform organization, or anything like that. Okay, now I want to make this point, that this practice of enacting special and local laws was fundamentally inegalitarian. And it was inegalitarian because localities and individuals and groups of individuals differed enormously in their ability to go to the state to secure these kinds of favors, to secure these things that they wanted. And it's precisely for that reason that it persists. That is, this is a tool of organizing power. This is a way in which the people who were in control of governmental bodies built coalitions to keep themselves in the power by doling out favors to people who would support them. And people at the time knew all this. They knew that this was inegalitarian. They knew that this was a tool of essentially corruption. That's the way they talked about it at the time. And so this system was really a lightning rod for political discontent in the first half of the 19th century. But the complaints, for the most part, did not lead anywhere. Complaints, for the most part, did not lead anywhere because if the opposition that had been complaining about this corruption got into power, they tended to do exactly the same things. Because if they didn't, they wouldn't be able to solidify their position of power. So nothing much gets done. Now, this is not new in the 19th century US. This is the way most societies have been organized through most of human history and are still mostly organized today. And it was the way England was organized, right, in the 18th century. After that supposed glorious revolution, England was organized in this corrupt way. And indeed, the revolution, the American Revolution, is to a certain extent a set of protests against these ways of privileging elites in England that were privileged to the disadvantage of the colonists. So the very famous Boston Tea Party, right, is a protest against the tax bill which essentially allowed the British East India Company to avoid paying a certain set of taxes and essentially gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea in the American colonies. Okay, so American revolutionaries understood this problem really, really well. And they famously tried to solve it. They famously tried to solve it by structuring government around checks and balances with separation of powers. And the idea was that that would be a way of blocking this kind of tyranny. So this is famously associated with the revolution, with the Constitution, the federal Constitution in 1789. But it's also something that from the very beginning the states were building into their constitutions. So here's the New York State Constitution of 1777, I mean, right after the independence is declared, they go to write a constitution. They have two branches of government. There's a lot of text here, but basically what they're doing is setting up veto powers, a little different from the way they later get set up in the federal constitution, but they're creating a veto body, and they're creating a way of overriding the power of that veto body. Now, the point I want to underscore, they're all doing this. They're all building checks and balances into the state constitutions. They're building checks and balances into the federal constitutions. This is all about separation of powers. It doesn't work. It doesn't work in terms of stopping the kinds of behaviors, the kinds of corruption that were why they had revolted against England. And it doesn't, and if anything, it may have made the situation worse. It may have made the situation worse because the government was more difficult to control with all these checks and balances and separation of powers. And so you needed these awards of favors, you needed these privileges even more to organize power. So let me give you an example from banks, a quick example from banks, because banks were the most valuable, the right to form a bank was the most valuable privilege that you could allocate. And I'm going to continue to look quickly at New York. So this is an engraving of the image of the Bank of New York, which was founded in 1784, 85, I think, actually, and chartered finally in 1791. So at this period of time, in the United States, there's really two major contending political factions. There's the faction called the Federalists, which is famously associated with Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, people like that. And then there are the Democratic Republicans, who are associated with people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. This was an openly Federalist institution, as were most of the early banks. It was one of Hamilton's projects. It took a while to get it chartered because Hamilton and his allies in New York had blocked the charter for a rival faction. And so the other faction was trying to block them. They finally get this bank chartered in 1791. And then they're able to block almost all competing efforts to form banks. And they have a monopoly for a while. Aaron Burr gets around this monopoly by securing a charter for a water company. This is another famous story, which has embedded in it sort of a sleeper clause that allows him to form a bank. And then, that's the Manhattan Bank, which then becomes Chase Manhattan, and then has a long history. But he uses this bank to solidify support for Democratic Republican candidates in the 1800 election. And that's when Thomas Jefferson is elected president. And in fact, the Democratic Republicans are really crowing about this achievement of Aaron Burr. Burr is zealous and he will be active in his exertions, and this bank is going to help us. That's basically what the quote says. And then the Federalists responded in kind. Bank of New York then cut off all lending to people who were going to support Jefferson and Republican candidates, and they channeled their funds to Federalists. So the key point to take away from this really quick episode is that they had checks and balances, right? But power is organized in different ways, and the checks and balances really don't help. All right, well, in New York, bank charters continued to be used for political ends. It doesn't go away. In the 1820s, the main leader of the Democratic, now called the Democrats, the main faction of the Democrats is Martin Van Buren, and he really uses bank charters to solidify his support, and this continues in the 1830s. Howard Bodenhorn has done excellent work on this. This is a chart from one of Bodenhorn's papers. And the two columns I've highlighted are the number of people who are applying to the New York legislature for bank charters. And then on the other side, the number of charters that are actually granted. And you can see that many fewer bank charters are granted. That they're very valuable because all these people want them, and very few are granted. They're granted to this faction's political supporters. And Howard Bodenhorn, there's a beautiful paper he's done where he just follows the money and shows how all these transactions worked. Now, in 1837, this whole banking system in New York comes crashing down in the Panic of 1837. The Democrats are swept out of power. The opposing party, which is then called the Whigs, is swept in. And they are determined that they're never going to let those Van Burenites get power again. And so they come up with a plan. They enact what is called New York's Free Banking Act in 1838. And free banking is the general law. We're getting away from these special charters. It's a general law that says anybody can form a bank as long as they meet some very specific regulatory requirements that are common to everyone. So they took this big step toward general laws. Okay, so let me just draw out the lessons from this New York banking example. All right, so really important, separation of powers, checks and balances doesn't help prevent this kind of corruption. It may actually make things worse. Actually, democratic political competition might make it worse too, because you've really got, when you use, makes it harder to keep control. But it also creates the possibility that some elites will find it, some party leaders will find it in their interest, as the New York Whigs did in 1838, to change the rules and to move toward general laws. And I want to just suggest that this kind of a step was more likely to happen in the aftermath of a big crisis, a financial crisis, because there's just one party swept in, the other party swept out, and there's just this general sense that there should be reform and that the party can take advantage of. This said, the solution of general laws was by no means inevitable, right? It's quite possible that the opposition party would come to power and do the same stuff again as they had generally throughout history. It's also possible that they would have said, the problem is banks, let's just get rid of banks. And of course, that was what happened in 1811 and 1832 when the first national bank was not rechartered and then the second bank was not rechartered. Get rid of corruption, let's shut this stuff down. It also happened in this crisis in a number of states. So Louisiana responds to this crisis by writing into its constitution that the legislature can't charter any more banks. And then they go, oops. That was a bad idea. We need banks. Banks are already important to the economy by this period. So that's not going to be a viable option in this period. And so people are casting around for other solutions, and general laws were the solution that they came up with. Okay, so a few years later, just a couple years later, there's going to be an even bigger crisis following a crisis in 1839. And that crisis is what's really going to spread this concept of general laws. So what had happened was a number of states borrowed large sums on international markets to a large extent to finance transportation improvements, but they were doing other things as well. And then they got into trouble. All right, so this is a familiar story to many of you, but basically the success of the Erie Canal stimulated a craze of canal building. Over 3,000 miles of canal were built by the states, mainly in the 1820s and 1830s. Much of it was done in ways that were calculated to cause trouble. That is, there were no taxes levied to pay for this. The states just borrowed large sums of money and hoped that the revenues from the canals would be enough to pay off the debt. But it didn't work. Many of the projects were not good projects, not profitable projects, or maybe many of the projects just didn't have time to be profitable before the crisis hit. And so by the early 1840s, states were in crisis. They couldn't borrow anymore. They had to halt construction. When they halted construction, you didn't get the canals, you didn't get the revenues. States couldn't service their debt without tax hikes. And the voters said, "No way! This is you sold us, a bad lot of goods." And so a number of states just defaulted. So this is a chart from John Wallace's, an article by John Wallace that looks at the per capita at state debt and total and per capita state debt, and they're ranked in terms of the amount of that per capita debt, and you can see that 9 of the top states, actually 1 of the territory, default on their obligations in in national and international markets. And then the next group of states just teetered on the brink of default. Well, so this is a catastrophe. This is a much bigger crisis than the Panic of 1837. It provoked a political earthquake, really, that in turn led to a massive transformation in state governments as states moved to revise their constitutions in ways that would mean this never would happen again. Okay, well, the change that they made that was most immediately related to this crisis was a change to about the way they borrowed. They had to get voter approval to borrow and levy taxes and things like that. But most states went further than that. Most states went further than just the financial aspect of it, and they reformed government in other ways, and they started this big move toward general laws. So Indiana is the first place, as I've suggested to you, where voters connected all the dots and connected this crisis to the problem of special and local legislation. And so what they basically thought was that the focus on all this special and local legislation had corrupted the political process to such an extent that localities were only out for themselves or for their leading citizens, and no one was paying attention to the big picture. There was just a lot of pork and not much, and nobody was looking at the big picture. So in Indiana, to show you what was going on, this picture explains why in Indiana they were able to connect the dots. They built this mammoth system of transportation improvements, canals, but also railroads and roads. And this was something for everyone, because people in the state wanted transportation improvements, but they didn't want to pay for anything that didn't benefit themselves. So you get this huge something for everyone bill. So it's hugely expensive. The state of Indiana borrows $10 million on 5% bonds at a time when revenues in the state were just $60,000. So revenues aren't even enough to, they're an order of magnitude lower than what you need to pay interest on the bonds. It was just a matter of people looking at their localities and not paying attention to what was going on. And people, when this all crashed, then people began to understand this. They began to understand that this focus on just something for yourself was leading to disaster. And what's really interesting is that there's ideas in the air at that time that shape then how they interpret this crisis and how they move to general laws. So let me give you just an example from one speech at the convention. It starts out with just a completely clear analysis of the problem of log rolling, which is no one's paying attention, the bills are not even being read. But then it moves on very quickly to a statement of, well, when the people aren't paying attention, then all kinds of bad things start happening. And power may have been given to corporations which ought not to be trusted to any man or set of men. And then, you can tell that as they work through this logic, they get to the end, and then the answer is general laws. I just want to emphasize that, they are able to, they make these connections because these ideas are already in the air. There's been opposition for decades, for centuries, right, to the special privileges. What was new in this point of time was the idea that the solution to this was to have general laws. And you just start getting glimmerings of this in the 1830s that lead to the New York Free Banking Act. But then this idea starts taking off, so that the delegates already had it in their head when they showed up in the convention. They come in and they make these resolutions that say, we've got to do this and this and this in our constitutional revisions. And you're not going to be able to read this, but I just wanted to give you one example. the delegates come in. This is, remember, caused by a default. Number one recommendation is direct election of judges, we haven't talked about that, but everything else is at the top is exactly what we've been talking about. That corporations shall only be created by general laws, that special legislation should be prohibited, that the legislature should not be granting divorces. Okay, these are the things that are above number 5, which is about the legislature should be prohibited from borrowing without a referendum. So these are what are in people's minds at the time. This is what they're coming. These are the ideas they're coming with. Okay. Now, I mentioned that Indiana is the first one to go all the way to general laws, but the stuff is in the air. And as more states come into the Union, or more states rewrite their constitution, then everybody is doing the same thing. Everybody is writing this provision into it that's prohibiting special and local legislation, mandating that laws be general. Now, I was going to tell you something about Kansas, which I'm going to skip this, but let me just give you, Kansas is in civil war in the 1850s over slavery, and it's finally admitted to the Union in 1861, and Kansas writes 4 constitutions as part of that. The one extreme was the Lecompton Constitution, which would have brought Kansas in as a slave state, and when it was introduced in Congress, almost tore the nation apart a couple of years before the Civil War actually happened. And then Kansas ultimately comes in as a free state. And I won't take the time to go through this, but the constitutions are hardly different on the issue of general laws. The Lecompton Constitution is a bit weaker, but basically there's just already this consensus that even people who cannot agree about anyone else, who are going to fight a civil war with each other, are going to believe in the importance of general laws. And all those Southern constitutions that are revised, you know, both as a result in the Civil War and revised after again, all have these general law provisions for the most part. Okay, so how does this matter? All right, I want to move on to talk about how these things likely matter. Okay, well, one thing we think is really important is that general laws make the economy more competitive, more dynamic, because now you're not going to limit these economically valuable privileges to specific people, but they're open to all. So we think this is pretty obvious, but it actually turns out to be very difficult to show in any way that would pass econometric muster. So I'll just give you a couple of data points. The first is from Howard Bodenhorn, which shows the amount of bank capital per capita in New York compared to Pennsylvania at scattered years in the first 1800 to 1860. Now, 2 things you need to know. New York, of course, passes its Free Banking Act here in 1838. Pennsylvania doesn't pass a Free Banking Act until 1860. You can see that the 2 states look really comparable in terms of bank capital per capita until 1837. And then after that, New York takes off. That having more bank capital per capita has got to be good for economic development. And Pennsylvania actually loses ground in relative terms. Okay, I'll give you one other example, which is about the corporate form, about the ability to form corporations and how general laws may have mattered. Again, it's really difficult to do head-to-head comparisons because states kept these records imperfectly, and we just don't know lots of things that we would want to know. But here is some data on the average number of incorporations in Ohio and New Jersey from 1856 to 1889. And the things that are important to know is that Ohio bans special corporate charters in the in 1851, in fact. And New Jersey doesn't ban special charters until 1870 5. And so if you look at these two states, I cut it off here because that's when New Jersey passes its liberal general incorporation laws, and you get charter mongering and all kinds of out-of-state corporations charter in New Jersey, so it's not a fair comparison after that. But if you look at this, what you can see is that there are many fewer corporations in New Jersey until then, when New Jersey finally goes to mandating general incorporation, then then it starts to converge on Ohio. The other important lesson to draw is, as long as you still had the ability to have special charters, that just shut the whole process down, because no one wants to take out a general charter, because the people who are getting special charters can always get a better deal. And so but the number of special charters is limited by the legislature, so that just shuts down the whole process of incorporation. Okay. Now, I also want to say that general laws seem to have transformed the way government worked and the way the political system worked. Okay. So after you move from special to general laws, legislatures have much less to do. Okay. Their books were like big in the first half of the century, and then they get smaller later on because they don't pass that many general laws. And so they start going to biennial sessions. And you actually get a situation where the kind of people that serve in these legislatures change. So the real bosses serve there before. You see people with long terms of service. And then those people disappear after these constitutional revisions. The switch to general laws changes politics, right? So before, everyone went to the legislature for favors, but they were individual favors. Now people are going to lobby to shape the content of general laws, right? And so you get both the birth of the modern regulatory state, and you get modern interest group politics, and you get modern lobbying expenditures. And you get a different kind of corruption associated with that. But whatever the evils that might come of that, general laws also made it possible for people to organize at will and counter-organize against these changes. And that counter-organization blocked people's ability to secure privileges from legislatures, and also helped to prevent slippage into the back into the old ways of doing things. All right, in the time I have left, I just want to return to the question of equality. So general laws, what does general mean? Okay, that's the really big question that people have to ask. What does it mean that laws be general? Okay, could it be that general laws apply only to particular categories of people or particular categories of organization? Well, the answer to that question is clearly yes. The state constitutions that mandated general laws also had lots of categories in them. So, for example, there were categories that allowed businesses to be treated differently. They all had special sections of their constitutions for railroads, special sections of their constitution for banks, and so on. What about corporations? Could corporations, artificial persons, be treated differently from human persons? And the answer to that, again, is clearly in the original constitutions. Absolutely yes. That there were lots of provisions in these constitutions that treated corporations differently from other persons. Then you get this interesting development of the 14th Amendment after the Civil War, which lots of people in the general public, and sadly lots of scholars, think put a stop to that, and they think that there was this case called Santa Clara versus Southern Pacific Railroad that gave corporations the constitutional rights of natural persons. Well, that's actually wrong. Corporations repeatedly sued that when they were treated differently under the 14th Amendment. And they almost always lost. And I want to just give you one quick example. This is an opinion written by Justice Stephen Field, who is the person who is supposedly responsible for Santa Clara. And what Field said is that corporations are artificial persons with special privileges. They're the recipients of special privileges. And therefore, they can be regulated, and they can, without any problem. There's a quid pro quo. There is no encroachment on the 14th Amendment. As long as you keep everyone in the category has to be treated alike. So all railroads have to be treated alike. But it's okay to have a special law that singles out railroad corporations. In this case, this was a special tax levied on railroad corporations to pay for a regulatory commission to regulate them in South Carolina. Okay, but what about people? Okay, we talked about equality. What about people? What about discriminating against categories of people on the basis of race, on the basis of ethnicity, on the basis of gender? Are those categories okay? Well, at the time, they clearly were. And to drive home this point, I want to look at the same Indiana Constitution that mandated general laws. So this same Constitution says all laws have to be general, but the Constitution lays out who can vote. So white men, 21 years of age, can vote. Immigrants who are white and 21 years of age can vote as long as they declare their intention to become citizens. No Negro or mulatto. This is in the Constitution, so this is clearly a permissible category. No Negro or mulatto shall have the right of suffrage. And no Negro or mulatto, even further, can even come into or settle in the state after the date of this Constitution. General laws. Okay, so these provisions would clearly become impermissible. These after the 14th Amendment, and Indiana repeals those provisions in 1881, after actually the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And Indiana takes away the right to vote to immigrants in 1921. But the point I want to make is that this was a work in progress. This was a world in which people are wrestling with the idea of what categories are permissible and what does generality mean. But I want to suggest that we would have never gotten to the point, and then later, of course, in the civil rights era, you move to a world where laws that discriminate on the basis of race are not permissible at all. And I want to suggest that we would not have gotten to that place. This is my strong argument, which you can push back on if you want. But I think that the challenges to racial and other forms of discrimination required, as a precondition, the shift to general laws. Because so long as legislatures are able to make a law for you, and a law for you, and a law for you, it's very difficult to have any real check on discrimination. You can say everyone's treated the same, but then I'll give Joel some special privileges or Nathan some special privileges. Okay, so without this mandate, and I also think that without this mandate for generality, you wouldn't even have gotten to the point where it's possible to ask questions about what distinctions among people, what distinctions among organizations are permissible, what categories can you embed in the laws. All right, so let me just conclude then. So I think there's 2 points that I want to make about getting the model right. One is that scholars and policymakers need to get the model right if they're going to make recommendations to the world about how you should imitate American institutions. And just imitating the Constitution as many countries have found, because they've written the American Constitution into their own fundamental law, isn't going to work, right? The thing that really mattered, that got the institutions to work, was general laws. And so the other thing is that Americans understood in the 19th century that they hadn't gotten their model right. And really, American history is the story of getting the model right. So 19th century Americans recognized that the checks and balances and separation of powers that they had embedded into their constitutions were not enough to make democracy work. And they, through a painful process that involved massive crises and political earthquakes, they arrived at the idea that laws should be general, that they should treat everyone the same. But, and here's the important thing, general laws themselves don't bring equality because they allow for categorization. Indiana's constitution was blatantly discriminatory, but they set in motion a process that encouraged people to challenge the meaning of generality, to challenge the process of dividing people or businesses into categories. And that is the process, and that model, that process is really the American model that people need to know about and need to think about imitating. And of course, we're still working on getting that model right. Thanks.